Good evening and welcome to Poems On. This is the first show of season 3, and our theme is that of elegy or grief. And my guests are Allison Joseph and David Rothman. Welcome to you two. It's good to see you.
Hello.
Great to be here with both of you. Al, this series is a gift to everyone who watches.
Well, this is a strong theme, and I must say up front that I'm in awe of you two because you've been able to write about losses deeper than my own, because I have not had a spouse. And it's our inheritance as humans to live with loss, but mine have been different, and I think, not so deep. So I will follow up the two of you, but we're going to begin by having Allison read one of hers. Take it, please.
Okay. I have to make it back to my desk. Okay.
I like your house, Allison.
Well, thank you. It's a bloody mess, but
It's a poet's house.
It's a poet's house. I've been working on a series of sonnets, part of a manuscript that I hope will be called "The Widow Refused to Wear Black," because at my husband's funeral, I had a couple of rules. One was, since my husband's favorite color was blue, we were all decked out, encouraged to wear blue. And the other thing was, we had a chocolate chip cookie bar. So I've been flirting with the notion of how to conceive of death. And of course, death is this destroyer. It is this thing that comes into your life, particularly if you've lost your parents or your spouse or a sibling. It's something that just rips you out from under. But the conceit of this sonnet is, what if death was some other woman that he left me for? So death becomes a kind of adultery. So this is a sonnet entitled, "If Death is the Other Woman." You found a girl who's prettier than me and crept away with her when I was gone. My absence as a means to set you free. The rhythm of your heart now stopped, once strong. You found someone who knew all of your names, who called to you with sudden, strident song. And I remained behind, took all the blame, felt all the hurt of everything gone wrong. You found this femme fatale, this slick chanteuse, and listened to her whisper far too long. Though it was just a moment, just a ruse, to take you far from me, where you belong. You found this eager partner I call death, and I'm the one still here, in love, bereft.
Thank you. Well, I have three questions / comments. The first one is the knowing all the names. I like the mystery of that. I like that, the idea that we have our names for the world, and we have our names for our acquaintances, and our names for our friends, and our names for the loved ones. And but the sense here is that maybe there's even a name that you didn't know.
Right.
That she knows.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so that grabbed me. And then later, the phrase "took all the blame," which is going to be explained in one of the later sonnets a little bit more fully.
Mm-hmm.
That gave me pause when I read it, and then when I read the later sonnet, then it made sense to me. But the place where I wonder, where I have a question, is the phrase "where you belong."
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because that can cut in so many different directions.
It's the body's failure. So that's where he ended up. That's where he ended up belonging, not with me. There's this sense of resentment. It's like death is this hot chick who has stolen my husband, and that's where he ends up belonging. But of course, the reality is that it's just death is not a beautiful girl, a mistress. It's the heart stopping that I mean, literally, my husband's heart stopped. So it was just a moment between death and life for him. And
Wow.
In contrast with David's work, where he's talking about someone, the prolonged suffering of a spouse, which is so much harder, I think, personally, to write about, having written about that when my mother, who died of cancer when I was a teenager, having written about her. I think it's, well, we can get into what's harder and what's less. We can get into that over the course of
God
this.
knows it's not a contest, but
No, it's not. But I've thought about that a lot. Is it harder or easier emotionally if you lose someone suddenly, or if you've seen them over a series of months just leave slowly?
Yeah.
And
Well,
there's nothing you can do about it.
there's a reference there to the first poem that I'm going to read, actually. So thank you for putting it out there. But thank you for saying that the undertone of resentment in "Where You Belong" is part of it. That's I thought it must be, but it's good to hear that. Well, this is a good way to get us going. David, you want to be up?
Sure. Thanks for that, Allison. And Al and Al. I was going to read, this occurred to me, I the first time I read the poems, and then I never got back to you guys. I think that elegies are obviously a genre, one of the major genres of poetry, sadly ignored. And Al, I think your elegies are very powerful. Allison and I are unfortunately members of the club, which you're not in, but you don't want to be in it. And
No.
So ours are similar in some ways, but all elegies are kin. And it's really one of the most important things we can do with poems. In America now, people say they don't like poetry and so on, except you go to a wedding, and you go to a funeral, and somebody gets up, and you hope that they're not going to read something they wrote on a napkin, because all of a sudden it becomes very important to everybody.
Yes.
And so, it really is one of the most important things. And maybe for MFA graduation, people should be required to write a decent elegy and a decent epithalamium. But there are certain themes that emerge again and again. One of them is the dream. Milton does it, and that's what I think Ovid is doing, and many other poets have written poems of the dream of the late spouse, especially. But when I read Allison's very charming poem, it occurred to me that I have a poem in which death becomes my wife's lover. And I didn't send that one along to you, but I thought maybe I'd read that one since it speaks to this. It's the same. Go
ahead. It's a great connection.
Of course, in my case, death is a guy, obviously. Not a hot chick, but some guy. And it's called Bride of Darkness. To make the invisible appear, I lay. Under the bright star, where it's possible to meet the dead in words that transform paper, I summon a sweet ghost to drink the fill. To balance tiny bits of time and matter against the infinite abyss in which even molecular vibrations scatter. I wield a pencil that makes zero rich. She loved life and brought more into the life. She knew love and was known beyond your never. She wept and fought with demons late at night. Yet when she danced, her life became life's weapon. So, darkness, bring it on. Do what you cannot for now. I can put that up on the screen for you guys if you want to see it. If you want to make it.
I was trying to follow you really closely because your microphone was your level was dropping at the very end. So could you just read the last two lines again, please? Because I was able to follow until then.
I think I can improve that. The microphone was almost closed off. It said, so darkness, bring it on. Do what you do. You cannot win. For now, she's your wife, too.
Oh, great. Thank you.
In other words, she's now the bride of darkness.
Mm-hmm.
The idea, and it's obviously, we talk about the power of these themes, and yet all these poems are speaking to each other, and I think my own distant allusions are pretty obvious. I mean, that one, just to pick one of them, is to John Donne, right, in the Holy Sonnet. If thou shalt die. It's not the same, of course, but it's hard to. That was sort of echoing in my head for some reason.
Yeah, the construct is there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
Here, I can share it if you want, and then you could see.
Well, yeah, actually, if you send them, if you hold your fire and send them all when we're done.
Sure.
Or send anything. If you digress from the ones you've already sent, please send. Having read the other poems, and in fact, reading the poems from both of you, as you say, in a sense, all of these elegiac poems are kin, but it's also true that the particulars of the people that they celebrate are different. And so, it's in the specifics that we find our way through to the universals. So the line about the dancing, of course, I know enough about your wife from the other poems that I can put that into, into a context that makes sense to me.
Well, where it appears in the sequence, I hope perhaps it can stand on its own, but in the sequence, yeah, it would make a lot of sense. My wife was a very highly trained ballet dancer. She went to the School of American Ballet. She was, and then danced for the Kansas City Ballet and a number of modern. When a friend of mine saw a picture of her, he looked at me. This guy is a doctor, one of the doctors who was caring for her. He looked at her and he said, "Man, you sure were batting above your weight." She's very, very beautiful. Look, she was a world-class dancer, ballet, modern day.
Well, you have that line about the bunions on her feet from,
She would file them off. They were quite big, point shoes.
Well, this is filling out my comment. I mean, we get a lot of these specifics, and it's the specifics that really draw this indelible picture of these people. I mean, these poems, they all bear witness to your life experience, and some of them go beyond that. But I mean, they speak to me despite my not having had a spouse. So there is that. You should know that. I'm gonna bring my first one to bear here, and this really is related in the sense that I'm going to read Cut Lines, which is a poem about a former lover of mine who is still with us. But it's a poem about the death in life of dementia. And so it walks that line that separates being here and being gone in a little different way. So let's see. Cut lines. Your friend told me today you have dementia and wouldn't recognize me if I called. Your intelligence had been a blade without a handle, honed to such an edge it drew your blood whichever way you grasped it. Slicing the reel with sensitivities which complicated everything they cut, you were forever finding extra meaning in the signals all around you, feeling everyone was sent to you alone. You saw your life ill-starred as magnified, and half believed you brought on the disasters which dogged your days yourself. The other half was earnest searching in the ordinary for sunlit places you could stand with others, not fate complicit, so their lives just happened. The outcome of your struggle wasn't clear when I had loved you, though I had the sense that right or wrong, the faith I had to have in you could never figure in the balance. How now to think of you? The question moved beyond both answers. Your intensity either gone mercifully dull or set on endless multiplying lacerations. No way for me to know or you to tell. And what to say about the memories we shared, the filaments our souls cast out to fix upon each other, those that bound us in the secret ways no one could cut, rooted in me still, loose ends adrift. There's a reference there to Whitman's poem about the filaments.
Yes.
If you know the spider poem, sending out the filaments to connect to others.
Wow.
So yeah, that's I tried to capture the personality of one. Shakespeare had Hamlet put it as thinking too, what is it? Thinking too finely on the event. Yeah. She had a conspiracy theory about herself.
Wow.
Yeah, and couldn't let it go.
She thought she would have to get herself.
Well, she thought that that everything that happened was the universe conspiring to signal to her personally. Good things, bad things, everything came down to a message to her.
Oh my.
Yeah, so it was.
Dementia? Did that begin with the dementia?
No, she had that when I knew her, when we were in college. So that was just her. That was her way of dealing with reality. And then now here at the other end of the rope, it's just magnified, or so I'm guessing. Neither her friend who told me about her, nor I have been able to get any kind of response. So it's a closed book that we won't be able to read.
Yeah, it seems to me that the dementia memoir has in and of itself become a kind of a subgenre of elegy now. And most
Sure.
of course. But I guess in contemporary poetry, you could look to Rachel Hodis's poems about her husband, which are very, very hard and very touching.
Yeah.
Because he had early onset dementia, passed away.
Wow.
She wrote very, very well about that. Very courageously, I thought.
Well,
very with a great deal of painful and difficult and compelling self-reflection. I can't remember which book they're in, but there's a bunch of them. It happened a while ago now. Happened in
Well,
the 50s. So it's
really,
that is a kind of an elegy, absolutely.
yeah.
Right.
I mean, what you bring up is something that I want to touch on as we get further in on the conversation, and that is whether, as artists in general or poets in particular, we're given a way of coming to grips with these experiences and our deepest emotions to try to make sense of it, that people who are not fundamentally creative lack. That
Look what you did to Allison. You knocked her off her chair. Your comments were so profound that she fainted.
Yes.
well,
That's
thanks for coming back. We'll talk about the question later when
That's a good question.
when things have calmed down. But I mean, what you say about Rachel is a good example, and that's what brought it to mind, was that it's a way of processing. And you two have a lot of work involved with processing these particular losses. And
right.
if you weren't artists or poets, you don't necessarily have the tools to express or to work through your thoughts and your feelings. So anyway, that's it for me. Let's go to round two and bring Allison to the fore here.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that notion of is poetry a tool to process grief, because on the one hand, that is our tradition. That is what we're supposed to do as poets. On the other hand, there's this big fear, at least I have this fear, that what I'm doing is self-indulgent, merely self-soothing, and isn't of literary value because it was so cathartic. So what I tried to do is move into, and thus turn to the sonnet, move into something that at least people will say, oh, okay, it looks like a poem. She's not just merely crying on the page because she lost her husband. So that's been a struggle, because the first poems and the last poem I'm going to read in my go round, when we get to our last poems, is much more closer to the bone, and it's much more of a litany. This one is based on January 6th, the actual day, and it was the day woke up, and my sister was helping me. I have an older sister. She was helping me get the bulk of my husband's clothing to Goodwill, which is one of those things you always have to decide. My father, when my mother passed away, she passed away very young, younger than I am now. I don't think he ever got rid of her clothes, that they were just in the closet there. So when he died, I think we got rid of 2 sets of clothes, if I remember correctly. But I had done a little bit of it, but this was the day where I said, okay, I'm going to do this. My husband had a lot of clothing, and he had been a lot of different sizes during his life. And I'm like, this is going to help a lot of people if I can get these really good clothes. I kept a few pieces, but if I can get these really good clothes to Goodwill. And it just happened to be an infamous day that we're still living with. And I thought on that day, well, it's good that he's not here, because I don't think he'd want to see this version of the country that he loved. So this is called Goodwill. Goodwill is actually 2 words because it's a play on goodwill. Goodwill. The day I chose to give your clothes away, the bulk of them, mind you, it's heavy work. Some so-called patriots busted their way into the Capitol. Your death's one perk. You didn't live to see this violence. So many heavy bags of your old clothes and pictures on TV not making sense. Hysteria that day, though my one goal was getting to Goodwill. I still recall how glad we were when visiting DC, that tourist day in Statuary Hall, enlightened by our tour guide's history. My darling, how you would have hated it. These reckless rioters, these dimmest wits.
Thank you. Well, I want to speak to what you said by way of introduction in saying that you were struggling with the idea of making sure that the work that you were doing would not be taken as simply self-indulgent. And I would connect that to this poem specifically in this way, that there are two forms of counterpoint in this poem that illustrates for me why it wasn't necessary for you to worry about that. Because here's something that you did. In this poem, first of all, you've got the counterpoint of the most public act and a very private act. So it's like what in German we would say Großwelt und Kleinwelt. In other words, the great world, people attacking the capital. And then here's one woman or two bringing clothes to Goodwill. So right away, you've got a counterpoint that one acts as a kind of an antidote to the other, because the other counterpoint is the subtext of motivation, that you're doing what you're doing to maintain a line of life and a positive interaction between people. And they're doing what they're doing out of anger and frustration and whatever is motivating them, that gives them what they think is permission to behave as the dimmest wits, to be rioters. So you've put these two things together that on the surface seem so unalike, and yet they work together because we see humans at almost their worst and then at very close to their best. So nobody is going to say that you're just being self-indulgent, or at least I'm not.
Right. I was leading on the discipline of the sonnet and the tradition. It's like, hey, people will at least realize that I'm joining that. But I'm also thinking of both my husband and I are history geeks. John was a history geek. So we were really embedded in that poem for me as the memory, and I just summarize it in a few lines, but the memory of going to where those people sought to destroy, all the statues and Statuary Hall, and you go and you're told, okay, don't get too close to things, and as an American, you're supposed to respect that, and I just felt so violated that day, and I couldn't figure out why until I wrote this poem.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, the specifics, it's grounded in the specifics in such a strong way. I mean, how many of the political comments made about those public acts even take into account life as it's lived on the other side of this poem? So,
And
yeah,
I do hope the turn at the end to the beloved saying my darling, that respects the part of our relationship that was really invested in talking about current affairs and politics and history, because that was, again, both of us were crazy about that kind of thing.
Well, you prepare for it in the immediately four preceding lines by bringing in the tourist day,
Yeah.
because it's something that you do together that contextualizes your interest in, in history. And then it brings it right now. I wasn't aware that the Statuary Hall is actually one of the places that they were trying to vandalize, but that just knits it together even further. Even being ignorant of that, it was still clear to me that this is a natural, I think it's a natural kind of thing to sort of apostrophize the missing partner at a moment when something comes to you, so
If I may.
please
I don't know,
do.
I think I was muted before, but Allison, it's not self-indulgent in the slightest. And of course, you're quite right to rely on the tradition in that way. I think it's Freud who says somewhere that the whole purpose of the formality of art is to enable us to say things in a way that are not self-indulgent, because they have all this formal discipline that enables them to become more accessible to others. And Eliot said, immature poets borrow and mature poets steal. I try to go another level and say, beginning poets speak for themselves. More advanced poets try to speak to others. The strongest poets try to speak for others. And that's what the best elegies do, of course. And the best elegies are among the best poems in the history of the world. And in fact, if you look at the history of the elegy in European literature, a lot of it's in sonnets. Petrarch, Dante writes the Vita Nuova, in the course of which Beatrice dies, and he writes sonnets to her.
Right.
Then Petrarch writes to Laura. Laura died of the plague in 1348. He writes sonnets to her. There's Longfellow's great sonnet to his wife. There's Milton's great sonnet to Catherine Woodcock. We're up to 4 there in Italian and English. Then there's Douglas Dunn's sonnets to his wife, who also died of melanoma, like mine, although it began in her eye. And there's, oh God, I'm blocking his name. He's been to Westchester. He's a wonderful writer. He wrote a book on blank verse, and he taught at Mount Holyoke. And his wife died of myeloma. Oh, I'm blocking on his name. You can see his face. And I know him. But he wrote a wonderful book to his wife, and wrote some sonnets to her. So, I mean, they're it's fairly exalted company, let alone all the other poets who wrote great elegies to their wives that aren't, or their spouses, mostly men to women, actually, which makes you a little bit unusual. There's Rena's poems and Ruth Stone's poems and a few others, but it's more often it's been husbands to wives. But
That's interesting.
It is. I mean, I've looked, as you can tell, pretty hard, and there's King's Exeky on his late wife, and there's Hardy's poems to his wife, which are actually, I think, very troubled. And what's his name, who wrote The Angel in the House and the great essay on Dipodic meter. He wrote a wonderful series of elegies to his wife, who died of tuberculosis. There's a lot, but in any event, the point is, when you write elegies, especially to a deceased spouse, in the sonnet form, you are entering into, you're swimming in the river. I mean, it's a tremendous tradition. I mean, the birth of the sonnet, of the modern, of what we could call, where the sonnet really takes off. It's not the birth of the sonnet, but Dante's Vita Nuova and Petrarch's Canzoni to Laura, sort of pretty good fountain to drink from, pretty high level. In fact, your poem, although I have another one I want to read, and vast majority of my book to Emily, which is ultimately called Orpheus Looks Back, it was a tough moment in life, is sonnets. And for that very reason, they're love poems, but they're also elegies. And I actually address all those poets in turn, because I'm very aware of what they did, and translate a number of their poems actually in the book. But in any event, I'm tempted to read a poem that I didn't send you, which takes up the same thing of the relationship of politics to person.
Go ahead, read what you like.
Hold on, I can find it very quickly. Here it is, if you're ready.
All right.
It's and by the way, I was very touched by your poem. I think you are swimming right there in the river, and it is no more self-indulgent. It's just not. What you're doing is you are making it. You're trying to help other people to feel deeply, because it's very hard to feel things deeply and truly and meaningful. And that's one of the things that a strong poem can do, and I think you're doing it. So there.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate
I'm
that.
grateful. I'm grateful for it. I also want to, one other comment in response to what Al said, which is that, talking about the detail of individuals' lives, if you look at these earlier sonnets, as magnificent and powerful as they are, I mean, they're memorable after 500, 600, 700 years. One of the things that's happened, and I think, Al, you do this extremely well in your longer poems, it's harder in a sonnet, but we're still both trying to do it, is to get the details of the actual real life into verse as best we can, which is really not something that people sought to do in that way. It's pretty hard to figure out exactly what is going on in Shakespeare's life or Petrarch's life or Dante's life.
Yeah.
Dante more just by reading their poems, because the details are, for a number of reasons, not presented in the same way. And one of the things that we do in the wake of realism, of course, is try to bring those things to bear. But here we go, at any rate. And I just want to say, I think both of you are doing it extremely well. It's really a privilege to be in the presence of these poems.
Well, I hope you don't expect me to argue with you. Please read this this connected dot poem of yours.
It takes a different approach, but it's a similar theme, very different approach. But you'll see why, perhaps. It's called Some Other Time. Some Other Time. Look, I know the world is filled with shit. Torrents of suffering and fear and rage. I am not blind and not an idiot. I know that history stains every page. I see the gleaming shards and hear the laughs of late night television's cynicism. I daily read the ugly paragraphs that proffer hate wrapped in a witticism. I know that missiles and brutality are being dreamed up and constructed now, right now. And this is the reality to which it often seems that love must bow. Yes, the dark brims over crime by crime. But I will write of that some other time.
Yeah. That belongs in a sequence, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah. Because I was having the same thoughts, of course. I mean, I don't want to over-explain it. I think it speaks for itself. But,
yes,
you're just immersed in grief and you're trying to express it. And then you take your head out and look around and go, whoa, that's messed up. But hey, the most important thing in my life is my kids, taking care of my children, honoring my late wife's memory. I'm not going to sell that. But that's not to say the other things aren't important. I just want to say, hey, I'm not like, I don't have my head in the sand here, but that's just not what I'm writing about right now.
Yeah, you have to pick your fights.
I'm writing about grief.
Yeah.
So what I love about this is the quality of the conversation at the level of verse, which is really what it's all about. I'm very grateful.
You mean that there's a kind of a conversation between her poem and yours in terms of how you address what's going on in the world against private concerns?
Right. Well, it's a conversation, and we are ourselves part of a much, much larger conversation.
Exactly. And
but conducted in sonnets, for that matter, going all the way back. I mean, look at Longfellow's poem to his wife, which was published posthumously, which is utterly, just so powerful. And one of the first great poems about Colorado.
Ah, well, you have the advantage of me because I'm going to have to look that one up. But
Called
I
the
will
Cross
do.
of Snow. It's called the
I'll
Cross.
do my homework. It's good to know.
Very, very beautiful, very powerful.
Um, well, if I had a sonnet and or a poem that followed along, even within shouting distance, what you two have done, I would trot it out, but I don't. So I'm going to do something different. Allison, you will know this poem because I read it at Westchester
Mhm.
just in June at the faculty reading. And this too is, well, this is a genuine elegy because it is about the death of a person whom for a long time we thought we would be married, but ultimately we were not. And as you'll see, that's mostly because of me and where I was and what I was and what I wasn't. And that's what happens when you're young, and sometimes one person grows up quicker than another, if that's one way to put it. It's called Too Green. Wait a minute, where's the first page? All right, hang on a minute. I'm going to have to pull it out.
You can just freestyle it.
No. I've got it prepared. Okay, Too Green. She left me for the man she was to marry years later. Truth is, I drove her away.
Mm.
Her love for me had never been in question. I read the notice of her death today. We hadn't passed a word in 40 years. They'd moved to Florida, opened a stable with a riding school. They taught dressage, 3-day eventing. Passions she was able to build a life around, and with a man who shared them. All were gifts I couldn't give. I imagine she was better off. But there had been a life for us to live in love together in that distant time when we were both deciding a direction. 5 years out of our youth, discovering the depth and quality of our connection.
Mm-hmm.
And we were innocent of how we could be changed in ways we'd never known before when we'd awarded with the name of love, strong feeling. This was different and more. We found ourselves buoyed by each other's presence, which seemed always immediate and here. For suddenly we'd breathed each other in, and we were easy in the atmosphere.
Ugh.
So we renumbered days together from the first appearance of love's true expression. Gradually, we trusted in the future. There seemed to be no end to the progression. I joined a band that traveled every day, and there were women listening every night, dancing at our feet and smiling up to catch my eye. I knew it wasn't right, but there was a lure in the unknown and a new unknown tomorrow night.
Mm.
The thought made me somehow unsatisfied with what I had compared to what I might. So when she asked if we could live together, I held back and used a lot of words I didn't mean to keep her on the string. But what she wanted wasn't what she heard. I wasn't honest. I was immature. But knowing I would not be otherwise for her, who knew how much time to come, I was a coward to content myself with lies. And then she told me she had taken up with someone else to shock me. I could feel the chill that numbed me to her hidden plea. And so I let us drift out of the real.
Mm.
I learned years later how she must have felt when I was finally ready for forever. Another woman got to play my role and show me why we couldn't be together. Once on our road, we can't be anywhere but where we are. If we could jump ahead or go back a little, we could make levels of readiness match up. Instead, despite our efforts and our will, we often appear to be in step, but only for a little while. Too green, my love was not enough, although I wish it had been more. So blame's beside the point. I couldn't have been otherwise, but shame's still in the way, and there's regret for what I threw aside. I read the notice of her death today.
Whew.
Al, you have a such a strong sense of character and the gritty detail of life. It's really strong. That was my favorite one of the ones you sent. It's a real elegy. It's
Thank you.
I don't know why you think it doesn't fit. I mean,
no.
What I admire about it is the realistic, almost novelistic sense of detail. It's quite compelling about both you and then the person whom you love, the woman you love.
Yeah, I like the self-indictment in it.
Yeah, when I read it at Westchester, you may not recall, but I described it as confessional.
No, you're obviously an extremely bad person, and it's I'm proud to know you. I'm not sure I'm ever gonna want to loan you money or anything.
Yeah, well, that would be wise, but I think that the essence of confession in the tradition in which I was trained is that you've got to look back over your life and your actions and be honest in assessing what your motives were and what the consequences were. And so I think I say exactly what I mean here. I don't look back on that time and feel guilty because I didn't have the resources that the situation called for, so I couldn't display them, and so I only did what I was able to do. And in those parts of our life, there are things that don't come into existence because we're not able or we're not ready. And so, David, I wouldn't say that that this poem doesn't fit. It certainly fits in an elegiac theme. What I would say is that you two had life stories that completed what this story left incomplete. And therefore, you had lives together with your spouses that make for a different kind of authority and a different depth of wound. But yeah, it's what it was. It's what happened. I can't change it. I can bear witness to it and try to be honest about it. And I do believe on this theme, all of us are writing about things that we consider really important to us, not a casual theme. And so this is what I had in one direction to bring to this. And I would say this further. The older I get, the more I tend to separate experience into two groups: the things that come into existence and the things that never find their way into existence. And so for the things that come into existence, whether they're short, excruciatingly painful experiences, they're still experiences of the real. Whereas we tend to look back, and this has been said very often, on the things that we didn't do or that didn't come into existence, and we have a different sense of loss over them because those are things because they were never real, they're in that other category and they remain unknowable. You two know your pain. I don't know what my life would have been like with that woman, because it didn't bring itself into a deeper existence. So I simply am saying that to acknowledge and honor what you two have done that I haven't. So,
Well, I appreciate that, but
Mhm.
you know, the subjunctive mood is just as powerful as others. I think the point of contact poetically is that, as somebody once said, I don't know who, I can't remember where I'm pulling this from. You know, the problem with trying to make sense out of life is that human lives don't end; they just stop.
yeah,
And there's a difference between ending and stopping.
Mhm.
You know,
Yep.
at the end of a play, in the text, it doesn't say stop; it says end.
Mhm.
And yet, you know, in order to make sense out of any human life, you have to tell a story of some kind. You have to make sense. You have to have some psychology. You have to have some set of relations. And it seems to me
Yeah.
that's exactly what you're doing. And it's
And you have to bear
worth
witness.
doing in any life that you care about, because if you don't do it, it will remain invisible for eternity.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what, when you bear witness, then you carry that life forward. And so in my two poems, in the first case, that woman is still with us, but I can't bring her life any more forward than that small effort. So anyway, I appreciate your comments, and I just wanted to clarify, because I really do. I think that in our lives, depending on our experience, we mark out what our most painful experiences are, but I would never seek to compare.
Right.
The things that have hurt me are good enough for me.
Well, I think what we might be talking about is the distinction between recognized grief and disenfranchised grief. And I learned that term from the sole book that helped me with grieving. People would, well, that wasn't poetry. Poetry always helps me, whatever I'm grieving. But the sole book that helped me with grief was a book called Grief is a Journey. And in it, the author makes a distinction between the recognized kinds of grief, like losing a parent, losing a sibling, losing a husband, and the ways that we don't recognize grief. For example, one of the types of grief he mentions in that book is the grief of someone who has lost a spouse because they're incarcerated.
Okay.
Now, that person is very much alive, but in a sense, they're grieving.
Yes.
So I think what we're talking about with the differences between the poems that we're reading this evening, that everybody recognizes if you write an elegy for your late husband or your late wife or your sister or your mother, everyone recognizes what that is, even little kids who don't know what the word elegy is. When I teach my beginning level classes every semester, there's two types of elegies, and these are the losses that people who are 18, 19, 20, 21, 23 years old usually face. Losing a grandparent, and there are lots of jokes about it, but it's often the first loss anyone experiences. And the other one I've seen semester after semester is losing one of their peers, usually to either drug abuse or an accident, a vehicle accident, whether that vehicle is a car or a motorcycle. So we all know what loss means. We just make these distinctions where we prioritize different types of loss. And as I've been working on these poems, and it strikes me that I'm elegizing a fellow poet because John was a poet, I'm not just talking about losing a spouse, I'm talking about losing someone whose story isn't complete. In fact, I have a whole manuscript of his poems that haven't yet been published. He had finished it, but he died before it was able to be published. He had a publisher and everything. So I think all of these types of grief are definitely valid, and we just need. It's funny that I'm keeping my own grief poems close to the vest, where I'm encouraging my students and my graduate students who are working on the grief of not just losing people, but losing identities. We're talking about people who are, very much talking about things that we didn't talk about as kids, and they're bringing it to workshop. And I'm like, oh, okay.
Wow.
This is all disenfranchised grief. Yeah, that book was one of the few I was in, and I was in a library in the section of books about death, and I kept on taking books off the shelf, and they all were ringing hollow, because a lot of them seemed to have, even though this was a public library, a lot of them seemed to have religious overtones, and this was the one that didn't. Excuse me. I also like the book because he took Freud to task many times. So,
well, that's a long and honorable tradition. Where did we stop? Did we stop with me? Are we coming back to you, Allison?
Indeed, you are coming back to me.
Please.
So part of the process of writing about grief is writing about the distinction between loneliness and solitude. And I was married for nearly 28 years and partnered for 31 to the same person. So, and we did not have children. We spent our lives educating other people's children and publishing other people and doing things for other people. So part of what I face day to day is each day is a reminder of what I've lost, and speaking specifically to other widows who are widowed with children. They don't have the time to feel sorry for themselves because they've got Jim's basketball game or Lucy's recital. They still have to function as a parent, and now they have to do the job of two people in one. I don't know as many widowers with small or teenage children, but my problem has been learning how to navigate life by myself. And this permeates everything, including you never realize how paired up things are until you venture out of the world, and the grief is still with you maybe, but it's cleared a little bit, and you say, let me go out to eat. So this is a poem about that. And this is a poem that people who aren't widowed or who are just single tend to relate to. Solo date. I step into the fancy restaurant. The server asks me if my party's whole. I say, just one. It's been my solemn goal to eat out by myself and not to chant, I can't go here or there because he's gone. He would not want me mired in my grief, so wounded that I do not seek relief from loneliness. Sometimes I want to shun the outside world with all its bright romance. The lovers out on dates, the pairs I see, engaging over drinks in that old dance I used to know so well. But now I'm free to speak of woe that lives in widowhood. The server is asking how I am. Not good.
Hmm. Mhm. It's something you have to get used to. For whatever reason, you go out to eat by yourself because it is unusual. I used to do every Monday night, I used to go out to dinner by myself for years, about 15 years. I did it to extend the feeling of the weekend. I just, it was like, okay, it's Sunday night, but I still have something more to look forward to. And so I got used to being the one who was sitting at a table by himself. And I always went to the same place. So it got to where the people knew me. And that helped create a kind of cocoon that made me feel not so, that I wasn't sticking out quite so much. But I was almost certainly the only person by himself
Right.
in the place. And you're aware of that. And I didn't have any other reason to feel self-conscious. So, you know, when you're used to being with another and now you're not, you have that whole other dimension to cope with. So did you get used to it? Yeah, you don't. We don't. We're not taken beyond the barrier in this poem, but.
Well, two things about that. The man I had a terrible long distance romance with after my husband died was a firm believer that anyone eating out by themselves was a loser.
Forgive me for laughing. Something must have drawn you to him, but that probably wasn't the thing that did it.
He didn't say that until after we had gotten involved, but so that notion was in the back of my head for a long time. And that relationship followed on smack dab in the same time where we're in the throes of the pandemic. So it started off as one of these things that felt like, oh, somebody else is going to love me, and ended up with, whoo, that was bad. But he was of the firm belief that if he saw someone out eating by themselves, that, well, that person is a loser and they don't have any friends. And of course I pushed back against that. And I said, you know, what am I supposed to do? You don't live near me. You come occasionally to visit me and see me, but day in and day out, it's going to be like this. But it's gotten better. My last birthday, since I was on sabbatical from my teaching job, I said, where do I want to go? And I took myself to New Orleans, and with the exception of maybe 2 meals where I happened to run into friends, most of my meals were alone, and they were New Orleans meals, so they were good. And New Orleans was a place where I had gone with my husband. We had spent at least 2 trips there, and this was like my 5th trip to New Orleans. So one of the sonnets that's in this sequence that I didn't send you guys is a sonnet about getting my fortune read by a fortune teller in the middle of Magazine Street. And I ask her, you know, is he okay? Is he? So, and basically, I was paying for someone to tell me, yeah, the cards say, you know, he wants you to enjoy your life.
Okay. Are you going to read that, or are you not going to read that?
I don't have that one. I don't know where
Okay.
that one is, but
I'll tell you a story when we're done with all of this. I'll
mhm.
tell you a story that I don't want to take the time up in this conversation, but it connects directly with what you just referenced. So, but for now, so is it? Do you find that the experience of dining alone is a different one depending on uh, what city you're in or what restaurant you're in, or are there places where you just feel more like that it's
Oh,
more and places where you can definitely feel a draft when
right. This is a very good question because I live in a small college town and there are places that we went for years. And some of those places I've had a hard time returning to, and they may be around the corner or down the block. Um, the interesting thing about New Orleans is I deliberately went to not so much restaurants, but some of the places that we had visited together as tourists. It's difficult. The place that we went, the city that is closest to where I live is St. Louis. So there are places in St. Louis that feel
okay,
like a memory. But I spend a lot more time, even though it's further away, I spend a lot more time in Chicago these days because actually we spent less time together in Chicago. Usually when I'd go to Chicago, I'd take the train up, unless we were going to the suburbs and doing something together. So it can haunt you in unexpected ways, in unexpected places, but you learn to, well, I'm hungry, I want a snack.
very good, makes sense.
Hmm.
Um, can I point the arrow at David?
Yes.
Yeah, but I need about a minute and a half to take a bathroom break, and I hope you'll edit that request out of this.
Yeah, hang on. I'll
It's the wine.
Oh, the wine's gone. Okay.
Stroking out. It takes a while. First, speech slurs, but you can still write. Then the writing goes, but you can still convey a yes or no by squeezing someone's hand. Then that goes, and there is a frantic motion. The eyes open, but it seems unseeing. Though there is still a sense of need, a final urge for dignity, not to let them go. Then at last all motion ceases, but for Chain Stokes breathing. And during this time, doctors say the mind stays clear. I held her in that final night, sleeping together one last time, drifting under the quiet, watchful care of friends, accompanying her as far as I could go, spooning at death's door, my face buried in her hair, one last time, holding the woman whose body had given both of us so much before it was consigned.
powerful. there's a quote I love from Zora Neale Hurston's novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, where Janie, his protagonist, is talking to her friend. And she says, you've got to go there to know there. And this is, this is an example of a poem that has such a stark authority, because you've been somewhere that I certainly haven't been. But I know that you know it. You've been there and you know it. And that's, for something like this, I don't think you can ask for more from a poem than to convey that experience with, as I say, such a sense of the moment, of the quality of the moment, the authority of the moment. So it's just very strong.
Thank you. I'm grateful that I given the ability and had the discipline to study enough to be able to be ready when it was time to write.
I understand that. And that touches back a little bit on the question that I asked early on, which was that as poets, we have a resource that's not given to other people, particularly people who aren't creative. But you're also supplying the other side of that it's fine to have the resource, but you still have to come to grips with your subject, and you've got to hammer it into shape at the same time that you're telling every bit of the truth that you can. And so I think what you said is exactly right, that it's it's a confluence of accomplishments. First, you had to have the experience, but then you also had to have the wherewithal to make it real in this form. And that didn't come because somebody woke up one day knowing how to do it. You have to work, and you've done the work.
We all have. Yeah, you have to do the work. It's, it's everyone in every art who's ever gotten any good says the same thing.
Yeah.
You know who Sun Ra was?
I saw Sun Ra at Carnegie Hall.
I saw Sun Ra play, 25 times. Sun Ra, he was, I lived in the Village, and I was a grad student, and he would play around the corner at Sweet Basile.
Sure.
He even had a bassoonist in his band, a guy named Jackson. I can't remember his first name. Very nice guy, and I'm a bassoonist. And he was amazing. And there's a great video of Sun Ra. I think he lived. They had a group home in Philadelphia or somewhere. It's Philadelphia. And there's a great interview with him where he says, some of the interviewer is asking some dumb question about music, and he says, man, it's just all about this. Sun Ra
yes.
music. It's all about discipline. And
space
it's true, of course.
Space is the place.
Space is the place.
Space is the place.
Let's walking up Fifth Avenue. And the guy was, it's all about discipline. And you do all that discipline. That's right. What I loved when people, that music was so joyous. Oh my God. It was like, I would just sit there like laughing and just made me, it was just the most beautiful thing. And I would, and his players were so talented, and it was such astonishing stuff. But at any event, Sun Ra, if Sun Ra says it's all about discipline, then it is surely all about discipline.
Yes.
Music is, if you're not familiar with it, at first you listen to it, you go, what?
Right.
But ain't it the truth? It's just, so, you do all that work so that when the time comes, and it's one of those 4 or 5 moments in a life full of thunderstorms that you've been walking around and that you get struck by the lightning.
Yep.
So, you're ready. And it is so worth it. to have done the work.
Well, I mean, this is why we do it. Is it for better or worse? We're a group of people that want to do the work to get to where doing the work gets us.
Well, this is what makes, frankly, this podcast special and our group special. Our group of how many of us are there? I don't know, 50, 100, who knows? Maybe a couple hundred of people who want to do this kind of work and understand how important it is. I have no idea how I could have possibly had a chance at putting this lightning in the bottle if I didn't know how to write. If I didn't have the craft and discipline and support of other people who do the same thing, like you guys, who write metrically, who understand meter, who care about rhyme, who think that it actually has a meaningful purpose in our linguistic efforts. And I can tell you some things about that poem, which doesn't rhyme, but has a sonnet structure, even though it's not 14 lines as well on it. But we, then we'd be getting into the wood shop and so on. But
yeah, but I take your point.
You have to be ready.
Yeah, and being ready and wanting to be ready are not the same.
Right, you got to work for a long time.
Yes,
a very long time.
Yes,
I started doing this stuff in this way. I had no, you just know that it's beautiful and meaningful and that it works and that it's attractive and then you just work and work and work. And then you get older and you realize, oh, that's why.
Yeah.
Because when your brother dies or your lover dies or your mother dies or your sister dies or your friends get married or something else happens that is of tremendous significance in a more public way, well, at least you have a shot.
Yes.
Because you've got a toolkit, you've got a skill.
Yeah.
You have a practice. You're not just a little volcano spewing something. You have some way that you can focus that.
Yep. You're preaching to the choir.
I know.
But for those, for those beyond the screen who may or may not be poets, because the audience for this conversation, it certainly is for poets, but it's also for people who are interested in language and interested in the power of language and interested in people that spent lives working at disciplines in order to be able to express something. Any good audience, a reading and listening audience, can get something from listening to what poets are actually like, because most people don't know any. So, I mean, Allison, because you're actively teaching, of course, you're in an environment where there's a spoken and unspoken covenant between you and your students that you're all involved in doing something that's worth doing. But whenever I can get people interested outside of that communal agreement, I went to an Irish pub on Mother's Day once, and a lot of people were doing different things and performing, and I believe I read the poem that I'm going to finish today with, and everybody responded to it because everybody had a mother. They didn't have to be poetry fans. And that's partly why I have a theme for every show, because even if you're not particularly a fan of poetry, you might like nature. And so you can listen to people talking about nature. So anyway, that's, again, I'm preaching to the choir myself. So let me pick it up. Here I have, this is a very new poem, and I'm not going to say about whom it was written, but some of you may know from the details of the poem. It's called What His Hands Have Touched, and it's got an epigraph from Stanley Kunitz from that last book of his when he was in his mid-90s. And the quote is, "Touch me, remind me who I am, what his hands have touched. The bronze busts, each one modeled by his hands, keep watch in a line along the wall, as though they pass on blessings in his name. In the kitchen and the rooms beyond, if there were a way to make them seen, the fingerprints would blossom everywhere, to show how life is layered in profusion of every kind of touch, to lift a spoon, pull out a chair, or make a small adjustment to a photo in a frame, to hug, uncork the wine, reach out to steady it when hands support a heavy dish at dinner. This home is dense with artifacts well chosen and well and often touched for what they are, all entered in the catalog of life as it is lived, day after day, for years. And though I hear you read about the way the presence of his absence makes you feel after the passage through a piercing time and numbing grief in turn, I feel him here in everything he touched, especially you.
Mm.
I'm not saying she didn't keep her house clean. That's me. I'm the one that doesn't do that.
Well, you're a musician. You're a jazz musician. Come on.
If that gives me a dispensation, I'll take it.
It does. I mean, I hope your yard's full of weeds and the whole bit.
It is. So, this is a little in the second person as it is, but not addressed to the one who is deceased, but to the spouse of the one who is deceased. I thought I would read it because it has echoes and overtones as though I was speaking to either or both of you.
Mm-hmm.
I thought of you when I read the uncork the wine line, David.
Mm.
I'm afraid it had a screw top. You know.
Well,
What can I
that's
do?
okay.
I prefer corks. I like
You're
that.
you're a musician too, so you get a pass.
Yeah.
But anyway, without telling tales out of school, that's my comment about the invisible world as it permeates the visible world. And as you said earlier, lives don't just stop, or they stop, but then they also go on.
That's the problem, is that they stop. But as human beings,
Yeah, we
not
can't let
God.
them stop.
we can't.
Yep.
We have to. If we don't tell a story, it doesn't make sense, and it just
Yep.
disappears immediately.
Right.
It's no longer
Yeah,
there. So
yeah,
what we're doing, we are conjuring the invisible.
Yeah. If you think about all of creation tending towards consciousness, we are nature inventing a mechanism where meaning can become real. We're the creatures that value and understand meaning. I mean, we believe in it. And that's why we create it, and that's why we share it. And the rocks and the fishes in the sea, if they're sharing meaning, it's on a whole other level. So it's our job to make sense of the lives of those that we love.
What could be more important?
Yeah, I mean, we're the only ones. Who else can do it? Who else can do it? So
my cats are unlikely to.
Yeah, well,
I have these two cats, and they're great animals, and I think they're highly intelligent. But neither one of them has ever come up to me and said,
Wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense.
No.